And that brings us to today in this chamber, where all of us are charged with plotting a path forward. No one is suggesting that we do nothing, but it's time to rethink the policies of panic. Now more than ever, we need bipartisan restraint. Consider this as we look forward to the next major spending battle. The President's budget calls for the next fiscal year to spend $3.94 trillion in 1 year, almost half of which is deficit spending, creating the largest federal deficit ever by a large margin, and building the federal debt to more than $12 trillion. It's difficult to imagine a number as large as $1 trillion. $1 trillion is a million millions, one followed by 12 zeros. It's hard to get our minds around this figure, but here's one way to look at it. If you had $1 trillion to spend, you could buy enough Chevy Malibu cars to comfortably seat about half of all Americans. And the President's budget spends almost $4 trillion, and half of it is borrowed. Let's think about it another way. If we borrow that $1.75 trillion in deficit spending contained in the President's budget at an interest rate of 3%, we could pay $143 million a day, every single day, and never be able to repay that debt. That's right, never. $143 million a day doesn't even cover the cost of the interest. You see, all we seem to be talking about these days is the need for action at any price, bear any burden, the need to work together to do anything, just anything. What's missing is the examination of consequences of the action. There's no talk of bipartisan restraint. From spending policy to energy policy to taxation policy, we need to show some restraint. The President's budget calls for trillions of dollars in future spending, such as the $634 billion down payment in his budget for a yet-to-be-determined overhaul of America's health care system. And on Tuesday, he called for a massive new overhaul of our educational system that would spend even more federal dollars in amounts yet to be determined. And so far, the policies that have been promoted in Washington, D.C. have asked rural states like Montana to subsidize urban states like California. While we all pay for the bank bailout, remember, Montana banks did not take 1 penny of that TARP money. And in the stimulus bill, every California resident received almost twice as much as every Montana resident, even though we all pay the same federal tax. Washington, D.C. is robbing Plentywood to pay Hollywood. The lack of bipartisan restraint is also creeping into our energy policy in the form of the so-called cap and trade policies. Let me be right up front. I support a balanced energy plan that includes development of traditional fossil fuels, as well as alternatives such as wind, solar, and geothermal, while at the same time also providing for conservation measures and the development of new technologies. But these cap and trade greenhouse emissions, like the ones advocated by the President's budget and the Western Governor's Climate Change Initiative, are touted as market-based solutions to the threat of catastrophic climate change. Unfortunately, the solutions, the cap and trade policies, would increase taxes on traditional energy sources like coal and oil and gas until they become so expensive that alternatives like wind and solar, which are currently more costly to consumers, look like a great deal. Make no mistake about it. This is a carbon tax, and some of the advocates of the cap and trade even boast about bankrupting the coal industry. Now is definitely not the time to be talking about bankrupting any industry, especially one that is currently responsible for more than half of Montana's electricity production. Montana cannot afford to hamstring our own economy. And whether it is at the state or federal level, we need to refrain from choosing winners and losers in our energy marketplace. Finally, the budget would repeal much of the tax relief we passed earlier this decade. Tax relief, by the way, which was not responsible for our current economic situation. Of course, a large percentage of the taxpayers targeted for this increase are small business owners. By raising their taxes, we're taking away opportunity and incentives for Americans to invest, to compete, to advance, and to grow in the market sector. We are strangling the goose that laid the golden egg. Worse, there are also efforts to limit charitable and mortgage interest deductions for taxpayers. The last thing we should be doing right now is making home ownership more difficult and charitable contributions less advantageous. If some of these policies don't sound like a good idea to you, you're not alone. Members of Congress from both parties are beginning to realize that thrashing about in a panic is equally as ineffective as doing nothing, and that doing the wrong thing is even far more costly. I'm aware we have differences of opinion in this room as well. Reasonable people can disagree. In fact, it's that disagreement that gives us our strength. It's our ability to keep each other honest that gives democracy its edge. Our economic situation is not hopeless. We need to rise above party, but not principle, in dealing with these issues. We need bipartisan action. We need bipartisan restraint. As Americans, we have more in common than we have differences as Republicans and Democrats. And I will always be willing to reach across the aisle to work with anyone who will come to the table. And in fact, just a few weeks ago when Congress passed the new S-chip bill, which I crossed party lines to support, I was one of a handful of Republicans invited to the White House for the bill signing ceremony. You know, the first thing the president said to me when I walked in, "You don't want to talk about S-chip." He said, "Hey, Rehberg, 10 and 2, 10 and 2. As the president's comment is the hope that Montana's values stick with us in Washington, and that somewhere between 10 and 2 we'll find the right answer so we can stop acting like panicked swimmers, begin to tread water, and then swim safely to shore. And history tells us we'll be stronger for that effort." Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. God bless Montana, and God bless America. Thank you.